Pop quiz. What elevates The Lord of the Rings over, say, the MCU? How about Dungeon Meshi over Food Wars? Warhammer over Skylanders? These are all pieces of media of similar scale, but it feels wrong to compare them like this, doesn't it? Can you think of what makes them so incomparably different? I'll give you your regularly scheduled think time to mull it over. Okay, time's up. Now let's check your answer. It says, what's Dungeon Meshi? Sorry, the answer I was looking for was world building. Lord of the Rings, Dungeon Meshi, and Warhammer are all gold standards when it comes to world building, and you should definitely go watch or read Dungeon Meshi right now if this is news to you. A lot of people are quick to write it off as just another cooking anime, so don't let that be you. Circling back to the main topic though, I'd be willing to bet you've heard people talk about world building before, even if just in passing. But when was the last time you actually sat down and had a long, hard think about it? If you're a lore nerd type, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I feel like most people likely don't dwell on stuff like world building much at all. We're all just here to gobble up our slop like good little consumers after all. We don't gotta worry about the plate that it comes on. But what happens when we do? Hell, what is world building anyway? It's not just the same thing as the plot, right? I mean, sure, a story's world building and its plotline can influence each other, but when you zoom out to the perspective that we see when we're considering world building, a single plot thread is just the tiniest little piece of yarn in a much bigger tapestry. Well, that's the idea, at least. Sometimes that one thread is all you have, and no matter how interesting it is by itself, there isn't enough there to work with to imagine a bigger picture. Take the Final Fantasy games, for example. The main plotline in those games is usually the primary thing happening in the world at any given moment, because their worlds tend to only be fleshed out as much as they need to be for the plot. And the plot is always made to be as epic as possible and have you finding some excuse to travel the world and inevitably kill God at the end. Spoiler alert for almost every JRPG ever made. And put a pin in that thought, because we'll come back to that soon. Conversely, J.R.R. Tolkien's world of Middle-earth feels demonstrably massive compared to any one story contained within it, and as a result there have been so many spin-off works that fit neatly into the tapestry woven around Lord of the Rings. Hell, Middle-earth was so well fleshed out that it went on to permanently inspire all fantasy literature made from like the 1950s onward. To cite an even more extreme example, many tabletop franchises like Warhammer and D&D are made almost exclusively with a world-building first approach, so as to give players creative resources to spin their own tales within those worlds. These are tapestries that don't even give you one thread to get you started, but inspire you to add your own, like one of those family quilts where people contribute one piece of fabric to the overall piece over like generations. So then, if world-building contains the plot, does that mean we're talking about, like, the setting? Close, but that's still not quite zooming out far enough. Considering something simple like driving to work. It's no hero's journey, but it'll do for our example. What would you say the setting for that journey was? Well, it'd be whatever day of the week it was, and whatever cities and painstakingly long stretches of road you had to drive. It's not exactly seeing the world, much less a substantial part of history. When we talk about the world, we mean it. Every location, every event in history, every culture, and every person. World building is the extent to which a fictional world has been fleshed out in terms of its geography, its history, its interpersonal and international relationships, and any laws, be they natural or supernatural, that it's governed by. To put it simply, let's say that world building is the extent to which a world feels like it continues to exist beyond the part you see. It's the power to make you feel like something has existed long before you got your grubby little hands on it, and it'll continue to exist long after you put it down. Knowing it's just fiction, but having it feel alive despite that. I still remember way back when I played my first RPG and fell in love with the world and the characters in it. The title read Final Fantasy VII and got me excited. You're telling me there's 6 more of these? I get to spend more time here? Have they made a sequel? Imagine my disappointment picking up the next game and realizing that almost nothing carried over. None of the characters, none of the locations, not even the genre of fiction was the same. Just the title. If only. I couldn't help but imagine what it would be like to have a game series that just consisted of infinite stories in a persistent world. As if somebody was peering into another world and documenting everything happening into a video game. Obviously, that's an unrealistic expectation, but it was what child me envisioned when he saw that Roman numeral. Now, of course, child me was oblivious to the fact that at the time, a small studio across the globe had a similar idea, and would begin working on a franchise that would eventually become an epic not too far removed from the dream game that he'd envisioned. A fantasy without the shackles of finality. I'm of course talking about the franchise that inspired me to make this video, the Kiseki series, tenuously known in the West as the Trails series of JRPGs. No, not the Tales series of JRPGs, and no, not the Trials series of JRPGs, the Trails series. It's a very unfortunate coincidence that there happen to be so many long-running Japanese RPG franchises that have similar naming schemes. Quick Japanese lesson. Kiseki, written with these two kanji, means miracle. Kiseki, written with these two kanji, is a word that indicates the traces left behind by a person or a thing. This is an interesting little homonym, as the former is a word that you'd typically expect to pop up in the title for a piece of fiction like this, and yet the latter is how the title was written, which is less evocative of an epic fantasy adventure and more of a car leaving skid marks on the road, or an airplane leaving, well, trails in the sky. Hence the translation of Sora no Kiseki, the first installation of the Trails series. My personal interpretation of this little play on words is that the series director Toshihiro Kondo, or potentially one or more of the few dozen other members of Nihon Falcom at the time, wanted to not only draw focus to the airships that would be featured on the promotional art for their game, but also wanted to emphasize that they were starting a franchise that would be larger than the sum of its parts, and that the story that they were telling with the game was but one glimpse at the traces left behind by its characters on the larger world of Zemuria that they were building. Or maybe it was a typo, who knows. But the Trail series is actually part of an overarching franchise of Nihon Falcoms called the AU Densetsu series, or The Legend of Heroes. Falcom likes to drag mutual headers or subtitles along its franchises like this when they share a mutual game director, regardless of whether the games are actually connected in any way. While technically Trails in the Sky First Chapter was also known at the time of its release as The Legend of Heroes 6, and even the newest Trails games still carry that moniker around, the Kiseki series has since overshadowed those 5 previous games and become its own more prominent franchise. So, for all intents and purposes, we'll be totally ignoring that header and simply referring to it as the Kiseki or the Trails series, and I'll just use both those names interchangeably. There's also a game by Falcom called The Legend of Nayuta Boundless Trails, which throws all sorts of unanswered questions in the mix, but we'll be ignoring that game too, to limit the scope of the video. And at the time of making this, the Trails series consists of 13 games, 12 of which have been fully localized in the West. The part that I'll be primarily discussing today, Trails in the Sky, makes up the first 3 of those games chronologically, which are direct sequels to one another and make up 3 chapters of a single overarching narrative. Although the 3rd chapter is really more of an epilogue and much smaller in scale than the first 2. The first chapter of Sky can also be seen as something of a prologue to the 2nd chapter, as it does a much better job of acclimating the player to the country of Liberl where it takes place, but the stakes of the plot in the first game feel astonishingly small, especially for a genre where you're usually fighting God by the 40-hour mark. Trails in the Sky does a ton of foundational work, setting up not only the geopolitical climate of the world, but also the time period, taking place about 50 years after what's known as the Orbital Revolution, a technological renaissance which parallels the invention of the steam engine in human history, which still serves as the core principle for basically all of modern technology to this day. I mean, coal is burned to evaporate water into steam to power a turbine to generate electricity. Oil? Burned to make steam to power a turbine. Geothermal? Steam to power a turbine. Hydroelectric? Turbine. Wind turbine?
Ooh, you better believe that's a
Turbine. I guess you could say this makes Trails in the Sky kind of steampunk adjacent, except instead of steam, you've got all this clockwork-inspired technology focused around words like quartz and orbments. It's kind of like how Final Fantasy VI could be described as steampunk but with espers and magitech. As you play through the franchise though, it becomes harder and harder to pigeonhole it into a single genre like that. As time passes with each game in the series, new technology gets developed, and the characters in the world have to deal with the culture shock of the rapid industrialization and modernization. It's likely that by the end of the franchise, we'll have fully transitioned into a cyberpunk setting. Although I made the comparison to FF6 earlier, the concept of Septium, which is the power source that drives the technology in Trails, probably has more in common with Mako and the Lifestream from Final Fantasy VII. Just like FF7, in the world of Zemuria where Trails takes place, coal and oil-based resources do exist and have been used historically to power some devices. As a matter of fact, the combustion engine even appears to have already been invented, but in the in-universe year 1150, before humanity could go full throttle on combustion engine technology, A genius inventor named Claude Epstein discovered how to harvest a new type of energy from simple everyday crystals, known in the Trails universe as septium. The linguists among you may recognize that the sept part of septium is the prefix for the number 7. This is also prevalent in the Japanese name Shichioseki, which, when you break down the kanji, reads like 7 brilliant gems. It sort of sounds like the word for obsidian, Kokuyoseki, which reads as black brilliant gem. The 7 here refers to the natural elements present in the world of Trails, to which each variant of septium represents 1. You have your 4 basic elements, which make up your foundational fantasy RPG magic system: fire, Carnelia; water, Sapphiral; earth, Amberyl; and wind, Esmalus. And then you have 3 higher elements that are said to connect planes of existence. 2 of them are literally time, Noval, and space, Goldia. And the 3rd higher element is called Mirage, Argem. Mirage was always an interesting one to me because it's so far removed from the tropes you'd normally associate with fantasy elements. The buffs and debuffs associated with Mirage in the Trails games make sense, as it's usually stuff like creating or dispelling illusions. But Mirage spells that deal damage tend to be more abstract, leaning more into the color silver associated with the element than the concept of illusion itself. My personal theory is that while time and space make up the separation between the different planes of existence, Mirage is what prevents us from, or allows us to observe them. Like the concept of the observer in the Schrödinger thought experiment distilled down into a measurable force of nature. It's a cool idea when you think of it this way, but unfortunately I don't recall any of the technobabble in any of the Trails games to date really going into it in all that much depth. They're more than happy to throw around the word quantum a whole lot in some of the latest games though. The energy extracted from septium is called orbal energy, or doryoku, which reads like guiding energy. What Professor Epstein invented was a means of refining septium into quartz, or kessho kaido, which can be read as crystal circuits, and orbments, or doryoku-ki, which simply refers to a device that uses orbal energy. If the term guiding energy sounds vaguely spiritual to you, well, that's because it is. The 7 elements, and by extension septium crystals themselves, are said to have been bestowed upon the world by the sky goddess Eidos at some point before the modern calendar had begun, over 1,000 years prior. Just like the Gregorian calendar, the calendar in the Kiseki universe, called the Septian calendar, was created by the dominant religious body in Zemuria, the Septian Church, which of course worship Eidos. Also, it's spelled Aidios, but in Japanese they pronounce it as Eidosu. And saying Aidios sounds silly to me, so I'm just going to take the difference and pronounce it as Eidos, like the game company. I mentioned earlier how most JRPGs follow through with the trope of the church being evil, and or the game reaching a climax of being forced to fight God themselves, if not some godlike allegory. Trails is one of the only pieces of fiction in which the church, although not perfect, doesn't really seem to have any nefarious ulterior motives. As a matter of fact, there are very few characters in the Kiseki universe that are one-dimensionally evil. Some absolutely are, don't get me wrong, but generally speaking, antagonists in Trails tend to be written in such a way that they do have their own value system, or some cause that they're fighting for. And this is made possible by the tangled web of geopolitics that is continually woven as the games progress. With each arc in the series taking place in a different country of Zemuria, conflict can naturally arise as a result of power or resource disputes, and lots of situations that arise are the smoldering embers of wars and conflicts that occurred long in the past, prior even to the events of Sky 1. One such conflict that gets referenced very often is the 100 Days War that took place in the year 1192, 42 years after the Orbal Revolution, and 10 years before the events of Sky 1. What you see here is a map of Zemuria. Currently, the Trail series has covered 4 arcs, each set in a different nation on this map. First, you've got Sky, set in the Liberal Kingdom to the south, a small but proud nation rich in exports and technology, comparable to Switzerland or Germany. Next, you've got the Crossbell Arc, situated in this tiny nation-state in the center of the map, famed for its entertainment and resort industry, much like Las Vegas or Amsterdam. Then the third arc is the Cold Steel Arc, focused in the Erebonian Empire to the north of Liberl and to the west of Crossbell. The Erebonian Empire can most easily be compared to the British Empire, having similar culture and similar imperialist tendencies, but it also kind of resembles the US and Russia in many ways, like its massive investment into the military-industrial complex. Then finally, the fourth and latest arc as of writing this is the Daybreak arc, which takes place in the Calvard Republic to the east. What's funny about the Calvard Republic is that it is so massive and culturally diverse, sharing a border with virtually every major world power in Zemuria. Within this one republic, to the north, the cultural vibe is more French. To the east around Longlai, it's very Japanese. To the southeast around Tarbad, it's very Middle Eastern. And to the south, Langport is basically the spitting image of Shanghai. As you can probably imagine, having these two massive superpowers right next to one another leads to inevitable tensions and border disputes. But the 100 Days War in question was actually primarily between the Erebonian Empire and Liberl. The story of how this war started is actually fascinating and not elaborated on in the first game, although you gather bits and pieces of lore about the war as all of the major characters in the game were largely affected by it in some way. It's speculated that there was supposed to be a sequence breaking down the events of the 100 Days War play-by-play in Sky Third, as some unused CGs to that effect were uncovered in the game files. But as it seems to be cut content, I'll paint the picture for you here. Keep in mind, this is my dramatized interpretation of the mountains of lore you find in-game across the series, and may be subject to some discrepancies. Prior to 1192, Erebonia and Liberl were in a state much like Russia and Ukraine prior to 2014, where Liberl is widely recognized as an independent nation, but Erebonia appears to be chomping at the bit to flex its imperialism, not hesitating to exert their martial superiority should the slightest justification for it arise. They received exactly the Casus Belli they needed when the small town of Hamel, located in southern Erebonia near the border to Liberl, was razed to the ground with no announced survivors. So Erebonia's military is massive, like large enough that there are distinct armies within its borders that themselves can butt heads and get into power disputes. You know the old buddy cop movie trope of local cops getting uppity when the FBI takes charge of an investigation?
I'm Agent Johnson. This is Special Agent Johnson.
I'm Dwayne Robinson, LAPD. I'm in charge here.
Not anymore.
It's kind of like that. Erebonia is a constitutional monarchy with an emperor of noble bloodline, but also an imperial governor that has similar executive power, but over bodies comprised of commoners as opposed to the noble houses. As a result, you have a system whereby the government has its own national armed force, which maintains the national borders and handles conflicts abroad, but each province of the country has its own noble house that owns the land and manages a private army of high-born conscripts to protect their territories. So why does Erebonia have a lineage-based class system to begin with? Well, that's because the very first emperor way back at the start of the Septian calendar, known as Adjucator Arnor, set in place a system of hereditary succession. And after nearly 100 generations, anyone who can trace their lineage back to Arnor can claim to be a part of the nobility. As Erebonia expanded, this system ended up morphing into a class hierarchy, as a way to maintain that only true Erebonians would remain in control of the land, as opposed to people who were once immigrants or otherwise had their territory absorbed into Erebonia's borders. Poignantly, most, but not all, of the descendants of Arnor tend to have blonde hair, usually with blue or violet eyes. I'll let you read into that what you will. In the events that led up to the 100 Days War, the town that was attacked, Hamel, resided in what's known as the Sutherland province of Erebonia, just to the north of the border, from which, due to the Krone and Nebel mountain ranges geographically separating Erebonia from Liberl, there's only one connection point, in or out. This connection point was a no-man's land of flat plains, sealed by two gates to the north and the south. The tightest gate to the north, manned by the Erebonian Imperial Army, and the Hakan Gate to the south, stationed by General Morgan of the Liberlian Royal Army. Very soon after the raid of Hamel occurred, the high-born Sutherland Provincial Army, led by the High Arms noble family, performed a swift investigation and ended up discovering evidence of Liberlian weaponry being used to raise the town. So, this is unrelated, but the High Arms family is led by Marquis High Arms, which makes the family a Marquisdom. A Marquidom?
Marquisdom.
I feel like most Americans like myself don't know these terms and have never bothered to look them up, although they pop up a lot in Japanese media for whatever reason. These terms are derived from the British titles of nobility, which go in order from lowest to highest of Baron, Danshaku, Viscount, Shishaku, Earl or Count, Hakushaku, Marquis or Marquess, Kolshaku, and then Duke, which infuriatingly is also pronounced Kolshaku, just with different kanji. I cannot tell you how many times I've heard these terms get thrown around with no explanation and just ended up nodding along stupidly. So I just needed to sort it out for myself once and for all and vent about it for a bit. Hopefully this is enlightening for others like me. Immediately upon receiving this evidence, an invasion force of 13 of Erebonia's 25 armored orbital tank divisions were dispatched through Titus Gate and across the no man's land towards Liberl. Although the Imperial Army at the time was led by its Supreme Commander General Van Dyke, the invasion force itself was said to have been spearheaded by one Divisional General Rudolf Arundel of the 13th Armored Division, a low-ranking member of the nobility. It's said that the Haken Gate, which at the time was comprised of a reinforced earth and stone, was penetrated with just a single shot from the 13th Division's orbital tank cannons. Almost simultaneously, an impeccably timed letter would be delivered to Queen Alicia II of Liberl from the Erebonian embassy within Liberl's capital. Within that neatly sealed envelope would be a pre-written declaration of war on behalf of the Emperor himself. In addition to a threefold manpower advantage, the invading Erebonian Imperial Army also had a technological advantage in the state-of-the-art Octsen model orbital tanks developed by the Erebonian-based Reinford Company. Utilizing blitzkrieg tactics with the mobility of these tank divisions, the Imperial Army quickly made its way to Bozy, Liberl's second largest city, and immediately brought it under their control within a matter of days, and continued its relentless advance through Liberl without missing a beat. Upon taking Bozy, a full-scale assault would be led by the Imperial Army's 3rd Armored Division, led by Lieutenant General Zex Vander of the Vander Barony, also known and feared as One-Eyed Zex, while Rudolf Arundel's 13th Division would lead the way eastward in a plan to engulf all of Liberl in a single blitz. In response, General Morgan of the Liberlian Army sought to impede the invasion as effectively as possible in the face of the Imperial Army's superior mobility and firepower. To this end, the Liberlian Army made use of the existing checkpoints separating the major cities at Vert Bridge in between Bozy and Roland, Krone Pass separating Bozy and Rouen, and Air Letten connecting Rouen and Zeiss. In addition, General Morgan also sought to establish a blockade ahead of Krone Pass near the rural village of Ravenu, known for its mining and agriculture and situated just a stone's throw to the west of Bozy. If the Liberlian Army could manage to halt the advance early using Ravenu as a supply hub, a counter-offensive to begin retaking Bozy could be in the cards. And of course, if Bozy could be reclaimed, the supply route to Arundel's eastward expedition could be intercepted, putting a damper on the entire invasion before it could even catch its stride. This would prove to be wishful thinking, however, as the blockade at Ravenu would fall, again within a matter of days, only serving to pull Ravenu village itself into the fighting, sustaining avoidable casualties amongst the villagers. Within just 1 month, both Rouen and Roland had also fallen to the unstoppable advance, with the Imperial Army at the capital's doorstep to the northeast, and already beginning to occupy Zeiss to the southwest. Although Rouen was an important strategic target, providing a route via drawbridge to the critically important manufacturing city of Zeiss, which was otherwise inaccessible by land, Roland was a different story. Roland was simply a stepping stone towards approaching Gransel from the northeast and cutting off supply routes to the nearby Malga mine. The invasion force struggled to make any more headway beyond that point, however, as the majority of Liberl's royal army had entrenched themselves behind the impenetrable Annenberg Wall, an ancient defensive structure surrounding the entire Gransel region that predates the founding of the Liberl Kingdom itself. As this wall is considered to be a relic of ancient civilization dating back as far as the 2nd century, the techniques used in its construction have since been lost to time. Regardless of its age, however, the Annenberg, a German name translating to ancestral wall, remains the strongest fortification in Liberl, if not one of the sturdiest fortifications in all of Zemuria. Because of its strategic value, the capital city of Gransel was constructed ground up from within its walls, rather than the other way around. As such, even the state-of-the-art orbital cannons of the Imperial Army struggled to lay a scratch on the walls, resulting in a battle of attrition to continue until Zex's forces could loop around through Zeiss to lay siege on Gransel from both gates, at which point it would only be a matter of time before Gransel falls. Arundel's forces were not content to rest on their laurels, however. With Roland surrounded, in an effort to reduce Liberlian morale and potentially force the royal army out from the safety of the Annenberg Wall, Roland's century-old clock tower would be chosen to be destroyed as a show of force. This structure was erected to symbolize the union between Roland, the Liberl royal family, and the Septine Church. By the 2nd month of the war, however, it would be reduced to rubble by cannon fire, resulting in yet more civilian casualties. While all of this was happening with General Morgan on the front lines, one Colonel Cassius Bright, exceptional soldier and brilliant tactician for the Liberalian Royal Army, was assigned a mobile task force to operate out of Leiston Fortress, a lakeside base just southwest of Gransel, with the critical job of establishing supply routes and routing communications between forces alongside his subordinate and student, the promising young officer Alan Richard. What Cassius and Alan's names would go down in history for, however, is their secondary mission to find a means to turn the tide of the war. To elaborate on Cassius a bit, the guy was not only a tactician, but also one of the foremost swordsmen in all of Liberl, wielding a katana, which was unusual outside of Far Eastern Zemuria, and attaining mastery of the Hachio Itoryu Rasen no Kata, or 8 leaves 1 blade helix form, earning the title of Kensei, or Divine Blade. Alan was Cassius' student both in matters of military strategy and in the way of the blade. While Far Eastern styles of swordsmanship have roots dating back over 1,000 years in Sumerian history, 8 leaves 1 blade was a style very recently started by its master Yun Kafai, known as the Sword Hermit, with the express purpose of unifying disparate Eastern styles of sword fighting, the 8 leaves, in a way so as to be passed down specifically to disciples not originally from the Far East. As a matter of fact, Cassius was the very first of Yun Kafai's disciples to have attained the rank of Divine Blade. Those who can achieve this level of mastery are said to possess what's called the Unclouded Eye, that allows the wielder to see the true nature of all things in this world. In practice, this tends to manifest as an almost superhuman sense of intuition. His unclouded eye would no doubt be a factor in Cassius' role in the war. Another month would pass, and General Zex would slowly but surely fight his way along the western side of Liberl, setting his sights on Zeiss to cripple the manufacturing capacity of the Zeiss Central Factory, or ZCF. The Zeiss Central Factory is considered to be one of the top 3 research facilities in all of Zemuria, alongside the Ruhr Institute of Technology in Erebonia and the Basel Institute of Science in Calvert, all 3 of which have ties to one of the 3 great disciples of Claude Epstein, the father of orbital technology. It's here that the world's first orbital airship was invented in 1168. Needless to say, shutting down the ZCF would put the nail in the coffin for any hopes of Liberl making a comeback. The second month of combat would become a hellish battle of attrition, with 85% of the country completely under Erebonian control, with the sole exception of Gransel, Leiston Fortress, and naval control over most of Valyria Lake, with holdouts hiding deep within the Zeiss Central Factory building and Malga Mine, protecting invaluable research and raw materials from falling into Erebonia's hands. Although these 2 facilities were still technically under Liberalian control, they were totally cut off from being able to contribute to the war effort. Notably, although it was a key point of contention during the war, there were no known civilian casualties to come out of Zeiss as a direct result of the conflict there. Although this can largely be attributed to Lieutenant General Zex's decision to not just simply demolish the factory, as Arundel had done in Roland, this was likely also due in part to the tireless efforts of one Dan Russell, a denizen of the city who was also an exceptionally talented member of the Zeiss branch of the Brazier Guild, an international organization dedicated to ensuring the well-being of civilians, while ultimately remaining neutral in the conflict. It was around this time that Dan Russell would sustain grievous injuries that would eventually force him into an early retirement, however. While conflict smoldered in Zeiss, One-Eyed Zex would continue his advance, reaching the Sanctheim Gate of the Annenberg, the last line of defense protecting Gransel from the southwest, where Officer Alan Richard was dispatched as a defensive strategist. God, can you imagine what it would be like to be an officer barely in your 20s and have your CO put you in charge of being the last line of defense in a losing battle? It speaks volumes, not only of Officer Richard's capabilities, but Cassius' faith in him. And that faith was well placed, because even in a pincer situation, with Zex besieging from the south and Arundel besieging from the north, and all 4 major cities conquered, and morale among the Liberalian Royal Army at an all-time low, Gransel managed to hold out among overwhelming odds until the end of the second month of combat, when a shadow would loom over the battlefield that would finally break the stalemate.
How can we compete with a military of that size? I guess this really is the end. Mom, Dad, I'm sorry I wasn't a better son. I'm so sorry. What was that? Where did those shots come from? Above!
I apologize for the delay. The cavalry has arrived. You can leave the rest to the Mobile Task Force. Onward to victory and glory. The time has come to win another day for our homeland!
Prepare to commence our final counter-offensive. Make the enemy tremble before the unwavering spirit of the Royal Armed Forces. Relinquish your fears and show them your pride. Victory is assured so long as we continue to press onward.
As those words reverberated in my ears, and as the tide began to turn, I was finally able to make sense of it all. The purpose behind our fighting, and those long bloody battles, was to buy time for this moment.
These airships were developed in secret for three-dimensional maneuvers. Nothing like it's ever been attempted before, but I know it'll work. However, it will require full support from the infantry. Men, lend yourselves to our cause. For our country, for your homeland. The fate of the kingdom rests on this battle!
Those orders put the fire back into the troops and rekindled a sense of patriotism towards our nation. As I stood there, unaware that I was witnessing a turning point in history, I took my gun in hand and stepped onto the battlefield.
Yet it turned out that Cassius had anticipated that the Zeiss Central Factory would be a priority target for the Imperial Army, and secretly relocated ZCF's engineering teams behind Leyston Fortress, equipment and all, without the Erebonians catching on. Among these engineers were two prominent figures, a father and daughter, Albert and Erica Russell. If the name Russell sounds familiar, that's because Erica is the wife of Dan Russell, the aforementioned bracer from Zeiss. While both were key players in the ZCF, Albert Russell in particular is one of the three direct disciples of Claude Epstein, and founder of the Zeiss Central Factory in its current form. This gambit, only made possible by Cassius's ingenuity and the combined resilience of the Liberalian army, the Russells, and the rest of the ZCF engineers, ended up buying just enough time to finalize development of a brand new model of airship, specialized to counter the Imperial Army's orbital tanks, which would be manned by none other than General Morgan and Colonel Bright themselves. These airships completely turned the tides, making the previously overwhelming Octzen battle tanks look like slow-moving coffins by comparison. Up to this point, Liberal's airship technology was primarily used for commercial applications, but in this limited time frame, Cassius managed to work together with the engineers from the ZCF to retrofit their existing models into armored warships. Not only were these new airships equipped with a reinforced hull even stronger than the Octzen's 18cm thick armor that it was named for, Octzen being German for 18, they were also equipped with anti-tank orbital weaponry and could boast a cruising speed of over 1800 Selge per hour. Yes, the Trails universe has its own measurement system, which is basically just a renamed metric system. 1800 Selge per hour would be 180 kilometers per hour, or 112 miles per hour. Fast enough to cross the entire country in an hour. These were the fastest airships that Liberal had produced to date. It could run circles around the Imperial tank divisions, allowing Liberal to use Erebonia's own blitzkrieg tactics against them. Additionally, as part of Cassius' strategy to retake the country, a naval counterattack of warships and transport vessels would be launched from Leyston Fortress across Valyria Lake to swiftly transport Royal Army troops to help retake the four major cities, cutting off Imperial supply routes and plunging all 13 armored tank divisions spread across the country into immediate chaos. Cassius had deliberately bided his time until the completion of the airships to mount this full-scale counteroffensive and swing the momentum all at once. By the end of the third month of warfare, without any means of resupplying and with the omnipresent risk of airship bombardment, the majority of Erebonia's invading forces had surrendered. But back in Erebonia's Vermilion capital of Heimdall, Imperial Army Supreme Commander Van Dyke still had yet more cards to play. Even with the overwhelming 3-to-1 advantage in manpower that the invasion force had, this was still only around half of Erebonia's overall military strength, not even counting the provincial armies. Among the reserve forces was the 4th Division, led by Lieutenant General Olaf Craig, said to be the strongest division in the entire Imperial Army. We'll never know what would have happened had Erebonia deployed the rest of their forces, though, because just as General Van Dyke was debating sending reinforcements to stem the swell of momentum that Liberal had gained, the neighboring Republic of Calvert finally responded to pleas for aid by assembling a sizable coalition force near both the Liberl and Erebonian borders. Alongside the Calvardian forces were representatives from other neighboring allies in staunch opposition to Erebonia's warmongering. Among them were the Septian Church themselves and the aforementioned Bracer Guild, who had come together to call for an armistice between the two nations. Finally, at around the 100th day since the war started, hostilities finally drew to a close, and Erebonia retreated its forces from Liberl entirely. By the next year, 1193, both nations would agree to sign a peace treaty. Although neither side ended up paying reparations for the invasion, the imperial government did offer an official apology letter to Liberl, citing an error in judgment regarding domestic affairs. Wait. Hold up. Cassius Bright, hero of the 100 Days War, divine blade of the 8 leaves 1 blade style, hanging up literally all of that. What happened? It's been popping up here and there, but what even is the Bracer Guild, really? And why would Cassius turn his back on the army to join it? To put it simply, the Bracer Guild is the Kiseki universe analog for a typical fantasy world adventurers guild, except much more heavily regulated and run like a non-profit organization. The Bracer Guild sets up headquarters in the major cities of all nations that will welcome them to ensure the well-being of civilians is their first priority. This includes the typical fantasy RPG stuff like exterminating wild monsters, but it also includes things like civil protection and aid in areas of need. Although the Bracer Guild accepts payment for their services, they'll never turn down the request of someone without the resources to pay. It's likely via donations that the Bracer Guild is able to operate and compensate its bracers. What sets them apart from, say, a police force or a standing military presence is that while the Bracer Guild is a neutral entity that pledges not to interfere in political or military matters, its utmost priority is the protection of civilians, meaning that it will interfere in military matters that result in the unjust harm of non-combatants. Hence their role in bringing a close to the 100 Days War, which brought about the loss of civilian life in a number of cases. If you'll recall, one of these circumstances was during the bombardment of the clock tower in Roland. Well, it just so happens that Roland is Cassius Bright's hometown, and residing in Roland at the time of the bombardment were Lena and Estelle Bright, Cassius's wife and 6-year-old daughter respectively. Upon returning to Roland at the end of the 100 Days War, Cassius would only find one of the 2 most important people in his life waiting for him. Trails in the Sky takes place 10 years after this incident, from the perspective of our starry-eyed protagonist, Estelle Bright, and her adoptive brother Joshua, as they embark on their own journey to become junior bracers. That was certainly a lot of build-up to introduce a JRPG, right? Well, the 100-Year War is just one of many events in Cimmerian history that make the world into what it is when we finally peek through the looking glass into the events of the first game. Of course, the world building in Trails isn't limited just to elaborate backstories. The games are alive with interwoven life experiences everywhere you go. Trails games are organized into chapters, and each chapter is then subdivided further into several story beats. A story beat is like a unit of time measured by intervals in which you, as the player, have to move the plot along. Every time this happens, every NPC in the game will update, doing something new or being in a new location and having something new to say if you decide to speak to them. If you were to pick just a single NPC in any Trails game and make it a habit to speak to that same NPC at every single story beat, you'll find that they're living through their own story completely in parallel to yours. A given NPC can have a chance encounter, then start a relationship, then get married, and then go on a honeymoon, all completely in parallel to the main story. Likewise, if some major event occurs, like say war breaking out, you'll be able to speak to each and every NPC to find out how this event is affecting their day-to-day lives. Some may be panicking, some may be thinking of ways to help, and some may be thinking of ways to profit from the situation. Every NPC is written with care in such a way that even if you don't remember each and every single one, together they paint a very vivid portrait of each city, town, village, mine, and farm, not as interchangeable set pieces that revolve around the player, but a clockwork of people, where the player is just a single turning gear. An important one, of course, but when you speak to these NPCs, you get the feeling that they existed before you started observing them, and that they'll continue to exist long after you aren't. To get into specifics, let's narrow our focus down on just the starting town of Sky 1, Roland. This is by no means a particularly large town, nor are its NPCs special in any way compared to other areas, nor is the Sky series particularly NPC dense compared to other games in the Trails franchise. As a matter of fact, the later games would introduce much larger cities with even more dense NPC bustle. But just in this modest town of Roland, we have these two own the local armament shop and live upstairs in the same building. As this is a small town, both have known Estelle since she was a baby and look after her like their own, especially when Cassius is away on business, which ends up being pretty often. Elgar hired Joshua as an assistant prior to the start of the game and expresses that he's sad to lose a promising employee of the Bracer Guild. Stella was friends with Estelle's mother Lena and cares for Estelle and Joshua like a mother figure would. She's a bit of a worrywart and prone to getting emotional, jokingly throwing around the phrase, "I'll cry," as if it were a threat. When Renan was a kid, he always wanted to become a bracer. Unfortunately for him, life doesn't always work out the way that we plan, so he ended up running the general goods store in Roland. We never learn exactly why he had to give up his dream, but we do know that he lives alone with a single mother. It's possible that Renan's father passed away when he was still young, and that Renan had to inherit the shop to keep the family afloat instead of joining the Bracer Guild. Renan's mother Bloom is a bit neurotic about finding him a wife. So much so, in fact, that she's propositioned almost everyone in Roland multiple times, including Estelle. It's gotten to the point where Renan himself is ashamed to be seen around town. It's probably safe to assume that Renan is around his mid to late 20s, and although we know nothing about his father, if he passed away around the time of the 100 Days War, that would put Renan in his mid to late teens, around the time that a normal person would consider becoming a junior bracer. So, it would stand to reason that that may also be when he would have been forced to take up the mantle of the shop. Despite his anxiety caused by his mother, Renan gets along pretty well with Estelle, and is known to stock Strega brand sneakers to indulge Estelle's obsession with them. It's wild how there are so many small business owners in Roland. I mean, of course it's a generic RPG trope to just have a shop owned by one person, but as the series goes on and nations industrialize and you get to see other parts of the world where shops start consolidating into malls and large corporations start taking over small businesses, you realize that this little innocuous thing that you took for granted was actually just a fleeting aspect of the world economy. Just like when this happens in real life. Zemuria at this microcosm in time feels very late 80s or early 90s. Melders is the owner of the Orbital factory in Roland, which is where people go to get their orbments maintained or repaired. One big example of this is the Roland Clock Tower, which was rebuilt in 1197 after it was destroyed during the war. While the tower construction was a citywide effort, Melders and Freddy personally took charge of getting the clock itself up and running. By Melders' own admission though, he's too old to understand how newfangled quartz circuits work exactly, so he leaves most modern orbments in his son Freddy's care, as he formerly studied orbital technology at the Zeiss Central factory. Freddy also maintains the orbital light posts along the roads around Roland, which ward off monsters in addition to just lighting the roads. Speaking of the Roland Clock Tower, the groundskeeper's name is Paddington, and he can always be found inside tending to the clock and the bell and making sure that it's clean and operational. Paddington is also one of the oldest inhabitants of Roland and remembers the 100 Days War very vividly, often waxing poetic about it when you speak to him. He views the clock tower itself as a reminder of the horrors of war, but also a beautiful symbol of peace for which it was originally built. Abend Bar is the local watering hole, but also a surprisingly well-received restaurant. Denzel, the owner, loves cooking more than anything else, and as such, he prefers running the kitchen and experimenting with new recipes to actually managing Abend. his employee Faulkner was hired with the promise of letting him take on a managerial role, but in reality, Faulkner just ends up managing the bar and attending to the local drunkards, while Denzel's wife Tabitha actually handles all the finances. Their daughter Alyssa is a childhood friend of Estelle's, and recently started working as a waitress at the family bar. She, Estelle, and Joshua all attended Sunday school together at the Roland Chapel before the events of the game. She's also been working on her cooking skills under the tutelage of her father. Speaking of Sunday school, Father Divine is the priest in charge of the Roland Chapel and taught the classes that Estelle, Joshua, and Alyssa had attended. Father Divine transferred to Roland from the Gransel Cathedral about 30 years prior and has been a key figure in Roland ever since. All members of the Septian Church learn some degree of medicine, but Father Divine stands out even among the church as an innovator in the field, taking Estelle by surprise as she gradually comes to the realization that the person who taught her to read and write was also famous for the advancement of modern medicine. Sister May is new to the Roland branch of the church and is slowly learning the ropes as she takes the responsibility of teaching Sunday school to the new generation of kids: Pat, Luke, Uni, Claire, and Anya. Pat, Luke, and Uni are a trio that often play together and subsequently get into trouble, with Uni being the youngest of the group. Pat's parents, Rhett and Sarah, can be found in town. Rhett is a reclusive bookworm that spends most of his time holed up under a mountain of books just reading. He makes it a point of buying any new novels that release and introduces the player to one of the in-game novelizations, Carnelia. Sarah worries that Rhett is too preoccupied with his books to worry about raising Pat, but admittedly could be doing more to look after him herself. Luke's father, Ashton, is a Royal Army soldier stationed at Vert Bridge between Roland and Bozy. Ashton spends most of his time at this checkpoint, so Luke is mostly looked after by his grandmother Maggie, who tends to spoil him, resulting in Pat honestly being a bit of a little shit, I mean rambunctious towards Estelle whenever you run into him early on in the series. Finally, Uni's father, Fate, is also a Royal Army soldier who fought alongside Cassius in the war, but was injured and forced to retire early. Fate has his misgivings about allowing Uni to play with Luke and Pat, considering that she's so much younger, and thinks that she'd probably be better off playing with the other girls instead. One of the other girls in question would be Anya, who's a little bit younger than Uni, just finally becoming old enough to attend Sunday school. Anya lives with her mother Frissa and her father Gaton, although as the mining chief at Malga Mine, Anya only gets to see her father on the rare occasions when he comes home. Malga Mine is a ways out from Roland, so it's apparently normal for workers to spend days there at a time on site. I love how, in stark contrast to the utopian ideal that we discussed earlier of every shopkeeper owning their shops, you've also got this persistent theme of absent parents. We never see Luke or Uni's mothers, and Pat, Luke, and Anya all scarcely ever see their fathers. Then, of course, Estelle and Joshua have their own very unconventional living situation, and we already talked about Renon's lost childhood. It all feels weirdly real, save for the occasional JRPG tropes. But then, to totally shatter that feeling of realism, we have Claire. Claire's a girl a little bit younger than Estelle and Joshua, but who acts nothing like her age. It's unclear where she got this inspiration from, but Claire wants to grow up to become a reporter for the Liberal News Service, and as such, stays on top of all the goings-on in Roland and takes every opportunity to interview Estelle and Joshua on their accomplishments. Claire is one of two notable exceptions to all the other well-fleshed-out NPCs in Roland, in that it's unclear who her parents are or where she lives. She just sort of hangs around in front of Abend Bar all day. She's also never seen spending any time with the other kids outside of Sunday school, instead opting to monitor and interview all the adults in town, hunting for a scoop. Claire definitely feels like she exists purely as an expository tool to key the player in on current events and world details, but honestly, I have kind of a soft spot for characters like this. Up to this point, the writing in Trails has been very good at portraying children as being childlike. Lord knows in most games, children are just written like small adults, and sure enough, the way Claire carries herself is reminiscent of some characters her age in later games that either lost their childhood for reasons like being a part of a noble family or child soldiers, or characters regarded as child prodigies. So, within the context of the game, Claire is likely a type of social savant, and I'd love to see Falcom bring her back in the future as a member of the Liberal News. The next three characters are a family that we rarely see together all in one place. Fremont and Eurydice are a newlywed couple, likely only having been married for around a year. Eurydice's father Radford was a longtime woodcutter in the forests around Roland, but had to retire recently due to chronic pain. Radford takes extreme pride in his work and won't approve of Fremont unless he can inherit the family trade and become a fully fledged woodcutter himself, a process that he claims takes about 2 to 3 years of apprenticeship. According to Radford, woodcutting isn't just a profession about exploiting trees for timber, but about keeping a watchful eye over the forest and giving thanks for its blessings. This would imply that in Liberl, woodcutters double as foresters, and in addition to cutting trees and processing the lumber, they're also in charge of things like thinning, pruning, and replanting, and are also the first line of prevention against forest fires. Fremont is nothing if not earnest in his efforts to pick up the trade, but Radford refuses to acknowledge him until he can prove that he's become a fully fledged woodcutter, much to the chagrin of Eurydice, who can see better than anyone else how hard Fremont is working and thinks her father's being way too harsh on him. I'm of two minds on this relationship. Well, for starters, it's omega based that Fremont is willing to pick up the woodsman trade just so Eurydice's father can approve of their marriage. On the other hand, getting an apprenticeship and a stable job alongside your marriage sounds like an insane 3-for-1 family meal plan. I'm kind of envious of Fremont, and it makes total sense why he'd work so hard not to squander the situation that he's found himself in. Next, we have a few miscellaneous NPCs around town, like Vern, the receptionist at Hotel Roland, who puts on a dignified demeanor at all times. He sometimes even uses people's straight-laced perception of him to mess with them. There are times when he'll intentionally behave more, for lack of a better word, NPC-like as a joke to mess with Estelle and Joshua when they're trying to speak with him. Trent is a character that wouldn't be on this list if he actually did his job. He's one of the miners stationed over at Malga Mine, but can usually be found around Aben Bar skipping work and stuffing his face. He claims that working at the mines always works up his appetite, and surely enough, when you meet him, he's almost always either eating or complaining about starving. Which, I'm not a doctor, but that kinda sounds like polyphagia and possibly hypoglycemia, and Trent should probably get checked for diabetes. Ida is a character that can be found in the outdoor seating area of Aben Bar, often taking a nap in the sun alongside her cat Errol. Ida is weird, to say the least. She is the other character who doesn't have a home anywhere in town and is weirdly ignorant of a lot of things, like what bracers do. Like Claire, she feels more like an expository tool than a fully fleshed out character, despite having more dialogue and interactions than most of the other NPCs. Replaying through the Sky series, Ida almost feels like the kind of character who it would turn out was secretly a spy or a mastermind of some kind. She's just too much of a sore thumb otherwise, acting uncomfortably familiar with Joshua and being too nonchalant about literally everything, including her own unexplained presence. Alas, Ida is just Ida. For now. And finally, we've got Armand and Ellie. These two have a mini love story that spans the first 4 games in the franchise. When you first spot them in Roland, Armand meets Ellie and falls in love at first sight, desperately trying to work up the courage to ask her out, to which Ellie refuses, stating that if he wants to ask her out, he's got to do it in a more romantic way. From that moment forward, you continuously spot the pair traveling around in parallel to your own adventure and get to peer into the looking glass at where their relationship is at that moment in time. Between the Sky and the Crossbell franchise, these two have around 650 lines of NPC dialogue scattered throughout. And the funniest part is, these two aren't even the most prominent recurring NPCs in the franchise. I swear you could make a whole other video about just these two idiots. All of these NPCs populate just the very first area you see upon being introduced to the franchise. And even then, I've skipped over some areas like the landing port, the mayor's residence, the Bracers Guild, and anyone who just happens to be passing through the area. Ever since the start of the Kiseki franchise, Falcom has poured inhuman amounts of effort into writing these NPCs in a way that makes them feel like more than just set dressing. This amount of laborious writing manpower is a unique microcosm of the games industry that will never be recreated again, especially now that generative AI exists to provide a lazy shortcut for this scale of creative effort. Trails in the Sky was written by a team of 6 to 7 writers across its various releases, headed up by the series' lead writer Hisayoshi Takeiri, who deserves a ton of credit for bringing the series together. By now, however, there are dozens of writers on the Trails team at Falcom working on not only the main storyboarding, but also the world building I've demonstrated that takes place via character backstories and NPC dialogue. There is, however, a third means by which these talented writers contribute to the overall world building of Zemuria. When Falcom hires new writers, before allowing them to take the helm by writing dialogue that'll appear in the mainline games, they challenge these fresh authors to write in-universe short stories or other forms of world-building literature, and then submit those for peer review amongst the rest of the writing team. If a short story meets a certain threshold of writing quality, it'll be put into one of the games as a piece of in-game literature that the player can acquire and read. Then, if those short stories are well received, the characters depicted in them will be introduced in later entries in the franchise, as the original people the embellished characters in the story were written after. In Sky 1, you can collect chapters of the novel Carnelia, which depicts 3 characters that make appearances in later games. I would love to sit here and just audiobook it for you all, but it would legitimately take an hour to read through all of it aloud, and people with nicer voices than I have already done this. So instead, I'll give an abridged version of the events of Carnelia that I put together after reading both the original Japanese version and the official English translation. Carnelia focuses around 3 characters: Toval Randiner, Ein Selnet, and Micht, an old shopkeeper who sparked the events of the novel and ended up writing and publishing it, albeit from Toval's perspective and embellished for the sake of entertainment. Carnelia opens on an ordinary gray-skied cloudy day in Heimdallr, the capital city of the Erebonian Empire, in the present year of 1202. Toval walks down a bustling city street and grabs an issue of the Imperial Chronicle newspaper. He notices the name Ein Selnet in one of the headlines and recognizes it from an event 3 years in his past. From here, we immediately flash back to a 22-year-old Toval on another similar day in Heimdallr, as Toval enters Micht's orbital factory. Micht has work for him, a smuggling job.
Hey there, Toby. Good timing. We just had some goods arrive.
Toby being one of Toval's several aliases, and one that he'd taken a particular liking to. Micht takes out an item wrapped in old newspapers, alongside train and airship tickets. Toby knew that he wouldn't get an answer, but he took a shot in the dark anyway.
So what have we got this time? Just see to it that it gets to the usual drop-off point in Liberl. You've always been a clever kid, Toby. You should know better than to sweat the details. For your own good.
Toval figured that the package was likely stolen goods, but that was nothing out of the ordinary. He'd been smuggling goods for Micht since he was a teenager, taking on shady or even outright dangerous jobs. So long as it paid well, that was all that mattered. As he exited the shop and headed towards the train station, he stowed the package away and put his left hand in his pocket, where he kept his trusty combat ornament affixed to a chain. Upon entering, he nervously checked his surroundings for authorities or anyone suspicious, noticing one conspicuous group of 3 imposing-looking men with similarly large builds and army haircuts talking amongst themselves. Should anyone around here start trouble, Toval was confident that he could hold his own with his orbital arts. That gave him the peace of mind he needed to keep his cool under pressure. Everything's gonna be okay. Toval clutched his ornament and muttered inaudibly against the deafening ambience of the station as he boarded the next southbound train. As he sat down, he noticed that every seat was packed with the exception of the one directly next to him. Micht must have bought it out as a precaution. If he was putting that much effort into this job, the cut must be well worth it. Are you traveling to Liberl? About halfway through the trip, Toval was suddenly approached by a woman who appeared to be in her 30s, with brown eyes and light brown hair. Quick interjection. It's here that the Japanese text describes Ein's hair and eye color, but those particular details are conspicuously absent at this point in the English version. It turns out that there was a bit of a fucky-wucky internally at Falcom, as the words originally used for Ein's eyes are chairo, which translates literally to tea-colored, but is a pretty standard way of saying brown. For instance, chapatsu, or tea hair, is how you would refer to a brunette. For Ein's hair, the author uses the word usuchairo, or weak tea color. It's clear from the context that the author intended for this to mean that her hair was a lighter shade of brown than her eyes, but it looks like the character artist sort of ran with this description, as the term usucha by itself refers to matcha tea made with less matcha powder than usual, the color of which would be a shade of pale green. As such, you'll notice that in a lot of her character art, her hair color varies from brown to various shades of green. It's crazy how things can get lost in translation even within the same language, but all in all, I think her character design is much more interesting for it, with the olive shade that they ultimately ended up with. Anyways, interjection over. Back to Carnelia. Mind if I have a seat? The smoke back there is awful.
Sure enough, a haze of smoked tobacco lingered around the train car behind her. Toval quietly nodded and pulled his bag closer to free up the seat. Despite wanting to keep to himself, he found himself in a full-on conversation with the woman. She'd explained that she was with the Septian Church, traveling to towns near the border for charity work. Toval reciprocated, saying that he worked with orbital devices and was headed across the border for business.
For what it's worth, people call me Sister. Sister Carnelia.
She let out a husky laugh behind her closed smile. It's only a nickname, though. A sister, huh? Oh, I'm Toby. The two continued their casual conversation long enough for the sun to begin to fill the car with a soft orange twilight. In the glint of the sunlight, the sister's eyes appeared almost a deep crimson. Toval couldn't help but wonder if that's not how she got her namesake. Eventually, the train would begin to slow as it started to reach its destination, and Sister Carnelia returned to her seat for the baggage check. Toval also took the opportunity to confirm his belongings, reaching into his left pocket for his trusty orbment as the intercom came to announce the arrival. The destination forecast would be rain. As if on cue, the sound of raindrops gradually began to rap against the windows. When it came time to disembark, Toval grabbed his things and stood up to head out the passageway, where he ran into Sister Carnelia yet again. Just as he was about to back up to put some distance between them, she stumbled forward, grabbing onto his shoulder for support, and looked up and let out an embarrassed laugh while gesturing for Toval to go on ahead. Upon walking out, Toval could feel the press of Sister Carnelia sticking close from behind. Too close. Instinctively, Toval reached into his pocket, but the usual comforting brass feel of his orbment was absent. Before he could realize what had happened, he felt his arm get twisted behind his back alongside the thread of sharp steel pressed right around his kidney.
I've got what you're looking for right here, Toby.
Sister Carnelia murmured softly into Toval's ear from the opposite side.
Don't even think of causing a scene. You wouldn't want me to have to hurt you, now would you, Toby?
As she was softly muttering into his ear, she gently twisted his arm just enough to cause a jolt of pain to course through his body. Although something about the way that she pronounced his name caused his ears to sting just as much as his arm.
You'll come along nicely, won't you, Toby?
Toval let out a whimper and nodded his head, and the pain subsided.
Don't get the wrong idea, Toby. I was heaven sent to watch over you today.
Upon being led out of the train and down the stairs from the platform, Toval spotted the same trio that stood out to him back at the Heimdallr station, waiting near the bottom.
Seems you've got quite the warm reception here.
He let out another laugh in the face of the situation that they were in. Give me back my orbment! He ignored his request and continued slowly leading him down the rain-soaked staircase.
Remember to watch your footing, Toby.
As Toval began to look down at his boots, he was suddenly launched forward into a full-on somersault, barreling into two of the three men, then landing face first into a puddle. Bag miraculously still clenched in hand as a cacophony of screams from onlookers rang throughout the station. By the time he could get back up to his knees, the men that were there seconds ago were nowhere to be found. Only Carnelia, with one of them slumped over her shoulder like a limp sack of grain, who she then tossed effortlessly down the railway tracks.
Time to go, Toby.
Sister pulled Toval by the hand out of the station and away from any onlookers, only letting go once they were far enough away. Toval wiped himself clean and noticed the lingering crimson stains on both of their hands. What had begun as a welcome party was now a departure. From here, Toval and Ein would find a nearby tavern to lie low in for the night. As they were eating, Ein noticed Toval was only poking at his plate, staring out the rain-soaked window towards the direction of the station.
No need to be so worried.
She spoke while wiping her hands with a pure white handkerchief.
There won't be any more on our tail for the time being.
Although her hands had been cleaned, Toval recalled the smell of blood at just the sight of her fingertips. How can you be so sure?
And that's just how these types operate.
Carnelia's steak arrived, and she courteously folded her handkerchief at her lap and began to eat. Eventually, Toval asked a second time, How can you know that there won't be more people after us?
Like I said, it's just how they operate. 1 3-man cell.
She cut herself off as if realizing something, then continued to elaborate.
Them as in Jaeger Corps.
That's who we're dealing with. Toval thought back to the 3 men at the arrival gate and recalled the term as something Micht had taught him about a while back. Jaeger was apparently a title given to certain distinguished mercenary bands.
Dang warmongers don't stand for nothing. Don't ever get involved with them.
Micht would say this a lot, like a turn of phrase.
It makes sense when you think about it.
The sister had cleaned her plate and began to reach for dessert as she continued.
You see, Toby, that thing you're carrying is bad news. Enough so that someone would hire a Jaeger Corps to rub you out.
But they're not after me, they're after the package.
To a Jaeger, it's all the same.
Carnelia brings a cup of tea to her lips, drinking it down to the bottom without missing a breath.
A chef wouldn't think twice about the cow that was slaughtered to cook a steak, and a Jaeger won't think twice about a courier killed to obtain a package.
She plunges her steak knife into her apple pie as she cuts off a piece. After a while, Toval zones out and starts to wonder what Meat is up to when he notices an abrupt stop in Carnelia's movements. He looks over to see her at attention, with a gaze like a watchdog. Suddenly, she tosses something on the table and stands up. It's Toval's combat ornament. Where are you going?
This is a fancy ornament you've got here, Toby. Now, assuming it's not just for show, it's impressive that you know how to use it. I'm sure those skills would go a long way if you were to take up being, a bracer.
Toval starts to get a little irritated at having yet another of his questions ignored. I asked where you're going.
No need to get all worked up. I'm sure we'll happen upon each other again in the morning. With those words, she made herself scarce and disappeared into the ladies' restroom.
Just as she snuck out, 2 men entered through the front door, stopping in front of Toval's table, and flashed a badge. We're with the Bracer Guild. Sorry to interrupt your dinner, but we're gonna have to ask you a few questions. As there was apparently no guild branch nearby, the 2 bracers took Toval to the 2nd floor of the tavern for questioning, opting for a room as far to the back as possible. Toval's belongings lay spread out on the table in front of him while the 2 bracers, one slender and one wearing leather gauntlets, whispered among themselves. They had given their names, but Toval had immediately forgotten which one was Clayton and which one was Pavel. They were apparently looking for the sister and Jaegers that had caused a scene at the station. By repeating everything that had happened from boarding the train up until now, Toval had managed to paint himself completely as a victim in all of this. In many ways, he was a victim in all of this. The woman's name was Selnat, Ein Selnat, a former Jaeger, but currently her affiliation and whereabouts are unknown. The slender-looking bracer flipped through his notes as he continued. Not exactly the type that an upstanding citizen would be having anything to do with. The bracer with the gauntlets added, while unwrapping the newspaper-bound item and checking for Toval's reaction. What came out was a chunk of metal with bits of clay stuck to it. I was in the middle of transporting this to a research institute. Toval blurted out an explanation unprompted, even going so far as to make up an address for a non-existent client as the bracers diligently took notes. He ended up spending the night in custody of the 2 bracers so that he could help them compose a written testimony at the guild in the morning. The next morning, he'd awakened to the 2 bracers patrolling the hallway, and a tall-statured lady, one of the tavern staff, dropping off a washpan of hot water and a bar of soap. As he got up to allow the woman to change the sheets and picked up the soap to wash up, he noticed something unusual. 2 unknown figures had stormed the hallway and were engaging the bracers. "They're here." Toval quickly shut the door and turned the lock, listening intently for the sounds of conflict coming from the other side. He tugged at his pocket chain hurriedly to grab his trusty ornament with his free hand. Wait, 2 of them? He recalled what Carnelia had said about Jaegers forming 3-man cells. In that case, where was the 3rd? Before he could even gather his thoughts, something tightened around his neck. His own bed sheets. Toval's only hope was to activate his ornament faster than it would take for him to pass out. Calling on his nervous tic of constantly fiddling with the device, Toval was able to activate the quartz circuits on his ornament with one hand. Within seconds, the ornament conjured a small blade of wind. At point blank from this position, the blade tore into his own legs a bit, but the sharp gust was forceful enough to send the female Jaeger flying backwards, boring a gaping hole where the 2nd-story window used to be in a spiral of shredded linens, broken glass, and a fine crimson mist. Removing the rope-like linens from his neck, Toval would have breathed a sigh of relief, if not for the sharp gasp of air that his lungs so desperately needed. He barely had enough time to wipe the drool from his chin when the Jaeger leapt back to her feet, still in the room with him. She had apparently leapt back in the nick of time to prevent the blade of wind from dealing too much damage to her abdomen. Toval instinctively flinched backwards towards the door, only to have it burst into splinters from behind him. He turned to see that the figure blossoming amidst the countless wooden fragments in the air was none other than Sister Carnelia. He cracked forth like a whip, using her momentum to grab the Jaeger's face and slam her to the ground while lifting one leg as if performing a pirouette, only to waste no movements in bringing her heel down to the Jaeger's windpipe. The sister beckoned Toval over towards the window, leaping to the ground as though she were hopping from a stepladder. With Carnelia to catch him, Toval also grabbed his bag and hopped down. The 2 fled back to the train station just in time to catch the first train. As Toval was reaching for his ticket, he realized now was likely as good a time as ever to finally toss the bar of soap he'd been desperately clenching in his left hand the whole time. The inside of the train reeked of smoke and freshly printed newspaper. Toval noted that this was probably the first time he'd boarded a train back to Heimdall with his bag still in hand. Sister Carnelia used her white handkerchief to staunch the bleeding on Toval's leg while she spoke.
You take after that orbman of yours, you know. Once your gears start turning, it takes a shock to the system to get them to stop.
Once finished, she placed down a folded copy of the Imperial Chronicle and tapped on a particular article. It was only a few lines about the suspicious death of an orbital factory owner in the capital. Toval regretted never having asked Micht much about himself, as this was the worst possible way to be learning his birth date for the first time.
You ended up cutting it real close, Toby. If you'd have been in that inn for 5 more minutes, you'd have been having this conversation with Eidos right about now.
Why is this happening? Toval stared at his bag while images of Micht's frigid corpse hanging over the store counter began racing through his mind. What the hell is this? Are we also going to die over this thing?
And that thing you've managed to get your hands on is an artifact. That's why you're being targeted.
I've transported plenty of ancient stuff like this before.
No, Toby. This one's different.
She looked him in the eyes and spoke at him as if lecturing a child.
What you've got there is still alive. Even now, it still works. Although, I'll admit that even I have no idea what it actually does.
He went on to explain that the item that he was carrying was excavated 30 years ago within the Empire's borders and had changed hands between the noble houses ever since. And every time, the previous owner would wind up dead in their sleep. Finally, its whereabouts were lost around the end of the 100 Days' War, until of course it appeared for the first time in a decade in the capital. The people who were after it sent Jaegers, and the church sent her to keep it from falling into any of their hands. Toval found it hard to believe that he had an item that so many people had died for in his cheap cloth bag. Micht, you old fool. You were in way over your head this time. But once we arrive, I assume we're headed to the cathedral?
That's the plan. If you'd like to come away from this in one piece, that's likely your only option.
They finally arrived at Heimdaller's Central Station, to a predictably ash-colored cloudy winter sky. No kicking me down the staircase this time.
I wouldn't dream of it, unless you can conjure 2 more of yourself for me to use.
It would seem today's welcome party had a larger guest list.
It's not looking good. There's no way we're leaving through the ticket gate.
The two looked for another way to exit the station. Flashing his ticket to one of the station staff, Toval gestured to Carnelia and convinced the worker that she was an opera singer trying to avoid getting spotted in the crowd. The man agreed and let them through a back exit by the cargo bay.
You're more resourceful than you look, Toby. You might want to consider finding a different line of work.
Are you going to suggest I become a bracer again? Toval laughed the idea off, figuring there was no way they'd accept him. Why don't you become a bracer?
That's never happening. They'd tear me to ribbons the second I set foot in a guild branch.
He responded while lifting a manhole cover leading into a drainage ditch beneath the city. As they walked through the tunnels, they could see and hear the clamor of countless footsteps populating the streets above from the storm drains overhead, confident that not a single person up there would bother to look down at them. Although the skies of Heimdall were characteristically dull, from the seemingly never-ending darkness of the tunnels they'd found themselves in, the rays of light that poured in from the world above was blinding to them.
This path should lead us to the Sank district, just outside the cathedral. Should be safer than trying to make it there above ground.
Well, what do we do if they come for us there?
Don't you worry your pretty little head, Toby. The church has got a lot more than just faith in its arsenal.
The two ran through the tunnels with Toval a distance behind. Carnelia gestured with one arm before turning a corner, with the other clutching the hilt at her side. Following her movements, Toval reached the same corner, nearly stumbling over the pair of bodies splayed out on the road. Toval caught himself and glanced forward to catch the sister sheathing her blade.
Well, it's Carnelia.
One of the Jaegers on the ground managed to cough out a warning through the blood rising from his throat.
He's over here.
Carnelia pressed on without looking back, so Toval followed suit despite being completely out of breath. Old friends of yours?
So the bracers filled you in, huh?
Toval nodded, but didn't have the heart to question further. Clearly with breath to spare, Carnelia caught him off guard by indulging him anyway.
Remember the girl at the inn? The reason I quit the Corps was because I didn't want to be the one on the receiving end of that heal. I didn't want to go out miserably like that. If I'm gonna die, I want to die fighting for something meaningful. Leave a mark to prove that I was really here before I wither away.
The two kept running until they heard a rumble, almost like running water approaching from behind.
You hear that, Toby? They've got the whole cavalry on our tail. Odds are they have an ambush up ahead, too, but we don't have time to make a detour.
Torvald caught his breath and steeled his nerves, clasping his orbment with sweat-soaked palms, and the two of them continued onwards. The Jaegers had set up a barricade of sandbags around a sluice gate up ahead, firing off arcs in succession as Carnelia blazed past, dodging by a hair's breadth. She vaulted the barricade and began dispatching the Jaegers one by one with clockwork precision, her sword seeking their throats as if it were being reeled in by a line.
There's a ladder just up ahead that should lead to the cathedral. The rest of them are closing in. We better hurry.
The rumbling from behind had now materialized into discernible footsteps and were only getting clearer by the second. Carnelia slid through a half-open sluice gate, and as Torvald was crawling in behind her, he heard a very familiar sound from overhead. The sound of an orbment being activated.
Toby!
Torvald's vision went white, and he was thrown face first into a puddle of sewage, but miraculously didn't sustain any life-threatening injuries. As the cloud from the explosion lifted, he found himself face to face with a platoon of Jaegers surrounding him, great blades drawn. Torvald rolled to the side to dodge one downward swing, then used his bag to stop another, slicing through the fabric and letting the newspaper-wrapped artifact plop to the ground. He dove after it, but another Jaeger had been laying in wait with his blade trained at Torvald's throat. The sword fell to the ground, and the Jaeger was sent flying, revealing Carnelia's silhouette. She fell to her knees as the light from the storm drains illuminated her into view.
I'm sorry, Toby.
Reeks of blood began streaming down her face.
Looks like Eidos may be calling after all.
Upon closer inspection, her cloak had been reduced to shreds, and the white cloth around her chest was rapidly beginning to stain crimson. She had shielded Torvald from the flurry of arts earlier and flung him to safety at her own expense. Summoning the last bit of strength, Carnelia stood up, drew her blade one last time, and let out a battle cry. Torvald snapped out of his stupor and grabbed both his orbment and the artifact and began channeling arts, causing both to activate and summon massive blades of fire, the likes of which he'd never cast before. The recoil of the powerful arts sent him flying back into a wall and knocked him unconscious. When Torvald finally came to, he found himself on his back, staring up at the goddess Eidos, stained glass-tinted light pouring into his eyes. The floor was surprisingly hard for a bed of clouds, and the face looking at him was much younger than he imagined the goddess looking. When the toll of the bell tower finally snapped Torvald out of his stupor, he realized that he was laying on the cobblestone of the St. District Plaza, at the doorstep of the Heimdallr Cathedral. In his hand was the artifact, giving off a dull glow that faded as he inspected it for a closer look. Alive was certainly the right word to use to describe this thing. He looked over to his side to see Carnelia laying next to him, still breathing. He pulled her arm over his shoulder and carried her into the cathedral, where the sisters rushed over to tend to their grievous injuries. In the following days, they would decide to hand the artifact over to head Archbishop Sigmar, so that the Septian Church could prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. Additionally, all the commotion in town forced the Bracer Guild to spring into action and work alongside the church to bring the nobles responsible for hiring the Jaegers to justice, having them agree to relinquish their artifacts in exchange for being allowed to maintain their estates. After his recovery, the church gave Torvald a rather lofty amount of hush money, which he would opt to use to take a load off at a high-end resort. He wasn't the type to hesitate to take advantage of this precarious situation he found himself in. Funny enough, the Bracers dispatched to escort him safely to his destination ended up being Clayton and Powell, the same two who had interrogated him prior. Before leaving, he managed to share a few words with Carnelia as she regained consciousness.
Call me Ein. That's my real name, after all.
Fast forward 3 years back to the present day, and Torvald finds himself holding an issue of the Imperial Chronicle with the name Ein Selnet across one of the headlines.
Yesterday morning, a body was spotted in the outskirts of Heimdallr with multiple injuries. The victim is believed to belong to Ein Selnet, who, in her life, performed charity work for the Septian Church and helped save countless lives.
Poring over the words, Torvald clasped his eyes shut and recalled an image of Ein laying at his side, her blood-stained visage resting peacefully with a smile on her face. He reached into his coat pocket and grabbed his Bracer emblem tightly. As of the past 2 years, Torvald now lived a life where he could proudly use his real name, although he would be lying if he said he weren't nostalgic for the way she used to make the name Toby reverberate through his head. She was the type to dive into the darkness of this world head-on, illuminating her path with naught but the fiery red glow of her own eyes. After a moment of silence, he opened his eyes to the orange tint of the streetlights beating down on the cloud of dust before him, dyeing the ashen capital into a distinct new shade. Torvald moved forward and faded into Carnelia. Phew, even abridged, that script ended up way longer than I was expecting.
As I mentioned earlier, all three of the major characters in Carnelia do show up in the Trails games at various points, and Micht admits that he embellished the story to make it more entertaining. It's funny how Carnelia's death at the end feels shoehorned in after surviving the big climactic struggle. I'm honestly not sure if it was written this way on purpose with the full intent of revealing that that part of the story was made up, or if the actual author at Falcom wrote it purely intending for it to be a work of fiction, and the staff liked it so much that they decided to retcon the deaths so that they could enjoy adding the characters to the game world. I want to draw some attention to that last line, because it's literally impossible to translate the original Japanese text due to a quirk in how words in Japanese can have multiple different meanings, sort of like the whole kiseki thing that we went over at the beginning of the video. This is the final line of Carnelia as written. Mind you, the original text is written in first person from Toby's perspective. Hei to no akari ga akaku nijinde shiroi kiri no kanata ito kiete itta. So at first, this looks pretty straightforward. If we translate it directly, we get something like the capital streetlights blurred crimson and disappeared into the white fog, which is more or less what the official translation ended up with. Of course, Japanese is a contextual language, and as the subject from the previous sentence was established to be boku, referring to Toval himself, that carries over, and it can be I disappeared into the white fog. But hang on, if the fog is white, what's being dyed crimson by the streetlights? This brought me down the rabbit hole of this word in particular. At first glance, it's obviously the word kanata, which means barrier or boundary, so it brings up imagery of a barrier of fog that Toval is stepping into. But this kanji also has other readings, like achi, which just means over there, or anata, which is a homonym for the word for you, which is rarely ever used in Japanese except when expressing a lot of familiarity. You can also use this word to refer to the boundaries between worlds. For example, ano yo no kanata is how you would write the boundary to the afterlife. And notice that the word for afterlife, ano yo, is written like that world, using the same kanji we see here. So what happens if we swap around the subjects and readings here? Well, one option is I disappeared into a barrier of white fog, which is the literal reading of the scene. Toval is walking into the fog. We also get the crimson disappeared into that white fog, which can be read as a metaphor for the passing of Carnelia and her moving on into the afterlife. Finally, we can also read it as the white fog dyed crimson and I disappeared into you, which would be a metaphor for Toval moving forward with his life, permanently tinged by Carnelia's influence from their adventures together. This may, of course, just be me reading too far into what's supposed to be a relatively simple ending line, but I just wanted to share all the thoughts that got evoked as I was reading and translating the lines myself that were impossible to convey otherwise. Anyways, that's enough about Carnelia. I've spent way too long obsessing over what would otherwise just be flavor text in an RPG. Looking back on the subjects we've hit in this video, we've gone over the world's history via the 100 Days War, the lives that the NPCs live by taking a closer look into the town of Roland, and the culture of Zemuria by reading Carnelia. If you're still watching, then I hope that means that you found this dive into the lore of Zemuria as fascinating as I do. Either that, or you've long since fallen asleep to my voice, which I guess is also kind of flattering in a way. Either way, I can't stress enough that even after all of this, we've only scratched the surface of the immense amount of effort and detail put into the world building across this franchise. The writing team at Falcom really took the expression quality over quantity and turned it on its head. When it comes to Trails, they really managed to create something special and irreproducible by sheer volume of writing, and made it so that even without going out of your way to talk to every NPC or read every piece of in-game literature, all of the writing still naturally serves to greatly enhance the experience of simply playing through the games yourself, which remains the best way to absorb all of the world building. I know that sort of defeats the point of this whole video, but it's a little bit too late to be noticing that now. Fortunately, as of September 19th, 2025, the perfect entry point into Trails will be released in the form of a full remake of the first game in the series, entitled Trails in the Sky First, which will also be the first title Falcom has ever released that will be an international multi-platform launch on PC, Switch, and PS5, with both English and Japanese dialogue. Up until now, Trails fans have had to patiently wait as games get launched in Japan years ahead of time, and slowly get localized and ported to other platforms. I'm hoping that Trails in the Sky First will be something of a watershed moment for Falcom, as Yakuza 0 was for Ryuga Gotoku Studios, another Japanese AA developer that I could gush on about for hours. Thanks for watching, and if you want to hear me prattle on about another game that I love to death, see my previous video essay about Voices of the Void, a game with the mysterious power to be both terrifying and cozy at the same time. If you'd like to see me continue to produce content like this, then a like and a subscribe will go a long way. I also enjoy streaming fairly regularly on both this channel and on Twitch, where you can find a link in the description. My name has been Mount Lover, and I hope I'll see you again. Until then, keep moving forward.